942. That's the number of men, women, and exomorphs that you as the player will wipe out throughout Elite Force 2's roughly 8-hour campaign, with 42 in the first 20 minutes alone. But it's not just about shooting, there's also puzzles, dating, and even a train sim, making Elite Force 2 more of an experience as opposed to just a shooter. Welcome, my name's Azadash and welcome to another PC game retrospective video. 2003 was a good year for sci-fi first-person shooters. Not only did it see the release of several sequels such as Unreal 2 The Awakening and Star Wars Jedi Academy, but it also saw its fair share of new IP such as Mace Griffin Bounty Hunter and Chrome. Among these releases was a follow-up to the largely successful Star Trek Elite Force, originally released in the year 2000. Now, publishers love sequels because generally speaking, if the first game is successful, then the sequel has a great opportunity to also be successful. And while Elite Force 2 certainly wasn't as successful as the original, it still sold relatively well. It was also the last Star Trek game ever published by Activision, and to this date, I feel that the loss of the Star Trek license by Activision was a poor outcome for fans of the franchise. I'm not going to pretend to know all of the ins and outs of what exactly transpired, nor is that type of discussion in scope for this video. However, what I will say is that since Activision ceased publishing Star Trek titles, we haven't had another first-person game set in the Star Trek universe. Which is pretty crazy when you realize that we've actually had 6 new series, not to mention the movies, released since then. Alas, Elite Force 2 remains the last released first-person shooter that we have in the Star Trek universe. The good news is that both the first and second Elite Force games are available to purchase on GOG. This is the version we're playing for this video, and apart from a small tweak to allow the game to render in widescreen, which I'll drop a link to in the description, everything you see is as the developers originally intended. While the original game was technically titled Star Trek Voyager Elite Force, the sequel drops a Voyager reference in favor of simply Star Trek Elite Force 2, and with good reason. Outside of the first level, you never actually step foot on Voyager, instead spending the majority of the game on the USS Enterprise E, with each mission having a type of intermission level based on the Enterprise before it begins. Now, it's hard for me to put this into words, but as a child, the idea of being able to walk around the Enterprise E, a ship that we only really had a glimpse of in a few movies, was simply amazing. I remember as a child spending hours walking around the corridors between missions, just exploring the ship. Now, in reflection, I probably explored the same areas over and over, but as a child, I either didn't notice or didn't care. It was the Enterprise E, and I was going to enjoy every moment as I explored it. Like the first title, Elite Force 2 has a really good story, but perhaps the biggest improvement from the original story is just how it's told. In the first game, there were both in-engine cutscenes and pre-rendered video. While they were both serviceable, the in-engine cutscenes were quite basic in their cinematography, and the pre-rendered cutscenes really stuck out when they were used, as it was completely different art design to the in-engine ones. What's here in Elite Force 2 is a huge uplift. Firstly, all of the game's cutscenes are in-engine, and make the overall narrative flow a lot better. But perhaps the biggest change is in the cinematography of these cutscenes. The pans, cuts, angles all work together to greatly enhance the overall cinematic quality of the game, a quality that is arguably one of the game's greatest strengths. Now, one of the story beats of Trek games of this era that I criticized in my recent Armada 2 video was what I called Borg fatigue. That is, the fact that in so many Trek games of this era, the Borg invading the galaxy was the key plot point. And while the first mission of Elite Force 2 is set on a Borg ship, it's actually a mission that does an excellent job of wrapping up what I always thought was a fairly large plot hole in the series finale of Voyager. I'm not going to go into full spoilers here, however, if you have seen the finale, I can pretty much guarantee that the first mission here will help fill in some of the plot that perhaps was not made overly obvious in the episode. Once the first mission is done and the Voyager chapter wrapped up, the game follows the player as they are reassigned to the Enterprise under the command of Captain Picard. From here, a fairly interesting story around archaeology and a new alien species known as exomorphs unfolds with a few twists and turns to keep things interesting. And here's a really nice touch. When you first start the game, the menu shows Voyager. However, once you complete the Voyager mission, this changes to the Enterprise. It's not a big deal by modern standards, but for the time, this showed great attention to detail and strong presentation. I wouldn't say that it's the best Star Trek story told, but it's certainly a very solid story and one that I really enjoyed from start to finish. Before we continue, a massive thank you to those who support the channel. If you enjoy this type of content, please consider liking the video or subscribing to the channel. With that out of the way, let's board a shuttle, land on a planet, and head back to 2003 to remember Star Trek Elite Force 2. While the first title pushed some of the boundaries on what a first-person shooter could be, with things like seamless level traversal, the sequel takes things much further, adding a lot of new systems and mechanics while making some tweaks to the existing systems and mechanics. The game uses the id Tech 3 engine, which always provides a fairly solid foundation for camera and control. Control is arguably far more important than it has been before, owing to the introduction of a fair few sequences which require platforming. Now, I'm generally not a fan of platforming in first-person shooters, but it's used sparingly enough here that when you do encounter one of these sequences, they feel quite integrated into the overall environment as opposed to something forced upon the player. For the most part, the platforming sections hold up quite well, although platforming is only one part of the new puzzle-focused gameplay, with there being a lot of new and creative ways the player can interact with the game world. Central to this interaction is the introduction of the tricorder, which serves a variety of purposes. Firstly, there are control panels which can be interacted with the tricorder to perform certain actions automatically. Then there are other control panels which launch one of several mini-games which often require the player to match a pattern or navigate a fluid maze, sometimes with the added stress of a time limit. More on this later. There are other more passive uses of the tricorder too, such as detecting structural weaknesses or visualizing gases or energy signatures, and these are all well integrated into the level design and story. There's an area in the game fairly early on where you see an enemy killed by passing through a certain point in a corridor, and for some reason my natural instinct was to run over to this enemy and examine it, which promptly saw me killed too. After a throwaway line by one of my teammates suggesting using a tricorder, I pulled out my tricorder and scanned for energy signatures, and yeah, there was a trap there which needed avoiding, made possible only with the use of the tricorder. In another situation, you were briefed that your tricorder can display gas signatures, but not given any other context. Once you enter one of the large set pieces, you find that poison gas is slowly killing you, so you've been told how to see it, but not how to deal with it. After examining the vents and thinking to myself, what would happen in the TV series, I pulled out my phaser and effectively welded the vents shut, saving myself and my team. This was a really great example of using something the game had told me, combined with something I already knew being a Star Trek fan, and putting it into practice. Now look, perhaps if I took too long, the game would have given me some type of hint, as the game is fairly forgiving in giving you a nudge in the right direction when needed, but I still applaud the overall design principle. There's also a night vision mode, which is practically required to locate some of the game's secrets, ranging from golden starships which unlock additional maps, to ammo and supplies. As far as the actual level design goes, it ranges from outstanding to somewhat average, with the majority being closer to the outstanding mark. Throughout the adventure, you'll journey to alien ships, planets, the hull of the Enterprise, and much more. And just to demonstrate the level of thought put into some of these environments, there's a level fairly early on which sees you on an Excelsior-class ship. And while I was playing through this level, I thought, wow, this is a really old ship for the time period the game takes place in. Maybe they should have picked a more modern one. Then I reached the bridge and found the name plaque, which proudly states, "The last starship of her class." It's a really small detail. I mean, it's literally 5 words on a small plaque that you could easily miss if you weren't looking for it, but the fact that it's here shows the level of care the developers wanted to give the franchise. The level and environmental design also excels at building tension in some of the more horror-focused levels, with several levels having quite a long period of simply exploring dimly lit areas before you finally locate the flood. I mean the exomorphs, which really helps to provide some much-needed relief from some of the game's more fast-paced moments. Now, this brings us to combat, and this is going to be something that some won't enjoy as much as the previous game, while others will enjoy it more. I'll start by saying that I think Elite Force 2 is a good shooter. I just don't think it's a very good Star Trek shooter. Let me explain. There was clearly a focus in development to expand combat. More weapons, more enemies, more bosses, more everything. The problem is that in an attempt to still keep the game Trek lore appropriate, decisions had to be made which impact balance in a large way. And look, there are good and bad parts of this, but far too often I was left feeling like I was playing Painkiller as opposed to Elite Force. And look, there's nothing wrong with Painkiller. And if you want to watch one of the objectively worst videos I ever produced, I think it was my second video on the channel, feel free to look at my Painkiller video. However, the problem is that Elite Force 2 establishes itself as a more narrative-driven thinking shooter grounded in the Star Trek universe, and then throws seemingly endless waves of spawning enemies at you. By far the most egregious examples of this are in the sequences which require you to protect something or someone. There's an area in the game where you need to protect someone while they do something on a computer, and the game spawns in waves upon waves of enemies for you to defeat. What makes this section really frustrating though was a lack of both ammo and health, combined with an enemy AI which was relentless in attacking the person I was supposed to be protecting. I died so many times in this part. I actually tried to lower the difficulty level, but then I realized that you can't actually change the difficulty once you start a game. The main problem was after I ran out of ammo for my heavy weapons, I needed to use the phaser, which has unlimited ammo but is far weaker, which meant I needed to draw the enemies to attack me. However, when I did that, I died. Honestly, it was the second most frustrating sequence in the entire game, and I honestly put it down to luck that I eventually made it through. However, this section doesn't hold a candle to the most frustrating area of the game, which is a section which requires you to protect the Enterprise engine room. There's two challenges here. One, I will admit, is my own issue. In almost all of the protect something areas, there's a meter which goes from right to left as something or someone takes damage. When it reaches the left, the person or thing dies. About halfway through this set piece, I saw the warp core temp, the thing you were protecting, mostly on the right side and thought, okay, I'm in a good position here, better quick save unless something goes wrong. Only for this situation, which is never again repeated in the game, the bar goes from left to right, with the far right causing destruction. Now, when I realized this, I should have just bit the bullet and loaded a previous save, which while further back would have been far less stressful, as once you complete the protection task, the game requires you to perform a fluid puzzle while the meter still increases. After failing this complex puzzle so many times, I finally completed it, seemingly seconds before the meter reached the far right, only to be told I needed to perform another action, which resulted in the meter then reaching the far right and failing the mission. Now, I eventually did go back to a previous save and was able to complete the section, but in terms of a difficulty spike, I would say this was substantial. The actual weapons are really good. There's everything from your run-of-the-mill phaser to a literal quantum torpedo launcher and everything in between. And I will say that due to the way the game dishes out ammo, it does encourage you to use your full arsenal as opposed to sticking to one or two weapons. Probably the biggest letdown about combat though are the bosses. Now, full credit to the first boss. The Borg Commander is an interesting boss fight that requires the use of the tricorder and some light puzzle solving in order to defeat. However, for virtually every other boss, it's a very simple process of strafe and shoot until the boss is downed. That's it. No mechanics, no strategy, just strafe and shoot until the sequence is complete. Like with the example I used before, this type of fight would fit right into something like Painkiller, but it doesn't really fit into this game. Outside of combat, there are a few simulation things you can do, such as visiting the holodeck to try out new weapons, accessing the Enterprise's computer, and even a bit of dating you can choose to partake in. While none of these things really have any impact on the overall conclusion of the game, they do serve as a nice narrative bridge between the game's main missions. Overall, I'd say the gameplay is at its strongest when it's being a thinking shooter and at its weakest when it's being a general shooter. I think there certainly could have been some changes to make things a little more balanced, with things like reducing the enemy count within the objective sequences. But in saying that, there's probably a case to be made that playing on an easier difficulty setting would have addressed some of these issues, something I wasn't able to do for this particular playthrough. In my original Elite Force video, I said that the presentation was strong. However, what's here in Elite Force 2 improves upon this in virtually every way to give the game one of the highest presentation values of any Star Trek game I've played. There's improvement to basic things like textures and lighting, but there's also a lot of little things that didn't really need to be done but have been done anyway. There's a section in the game where you need to exit the Enterprise via an emergency exit, and when you open the door, instead of the door just opening, it literally blows off into space. Like it could have just opened and you wouldn't think anything of it, but instead it literally explodes off of the ship, really helping to sell the overall immersion of the game world. Now, it's funny, this level in particular doesn't actually function on modern PCs without some modding, and honestly, I'm really surprised that GOG have not fixed this. The issue is that frame rates higher than 60 mess with the game's logic interpretation of gravity, meaning that when you try and jump in the low gravity area, you don't come back down easily. This combined with a particular set of objectives makes the level impossible to finish. Now, the fix is easy enough. It's literally changing a few letters in a file. I'll drop a link in the description, but I'm really surprised that GOG haven't corrected this in the version they are selling. Regardless, once you bypass the issue, it never comes up again, and it's certainly not an issue that I could objectively criticize the game for, given that in the time period it was released, these type of frame rates simply were not even imagined. As with the presentation, the sound design is excellent. All of your favorites from the TV series are here, as well as many new cast members who voice the Hazard Team and other people you meet along your journey.
Greetings, Lieutenant.
Tuvok, what are you doing here?
I had time for a brief stopover on my way to Vulcan. Congratulations on your new assignment.
Thanks, but I don't want to leave active duty for teaching.
There are few jobs more important than teaching.
Likewise, all of the effects and music are really good too, with a particular highlight being some of the ambient sounds used in some of the more horror-focused levels. Elite Force 2 is a good game and an easy recommendation for fans of the franchise. Although while it pushes boundaries to deliver new systems and mechanics, those same systems and mechanics at times push it away from some of the things that made the first game great. I think it would have been really interesting to see how the developers handled an Elite Force 3 game by taking some of the best bits of both the first game and the second game. Alas, with the change in publishing rights, that's something we're unlikely to ever see. It's also pretty crazy to think that in over 20 years, with all of the new Star Trek IP and literally a universe full of stories to be told, we still haven't got another Star Trek first-person shooter. I'm certainly not a publisher, but I would argue that there would certainly be a line of people prepared to pay for a good Star Trek shooter. How long we have to wait for that day, though, is anyone's guess. But that's enough from me. Do you agree or disagree with my opinions? Let me know down in the comments below. And as always, thanks for watching.